Hey, remember when I made that video on Monkey Ball 1 and I mentioned this?
But I personally believe that Sega is the most prevalent when it comes to dead franchises. Fans have been craving for the like of Jet Set Radio, Panzer Dragoon, Knights, Billy Hatcher, Virtua Fighter, Rystar, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Crazy Taxi, House of the Dead, Fantasy Star.
Yeah, we get it. Anyway, oh no, my window! Anyways, as it turns out, in the time since that video release, Sega's actually been making an effort to revival their old franchises that have been dormant for years, decades even. Now, I don't mean to brag or anything, but if you look at the date that I started working on that video, there's actually a high chance that I started development before Banana Blitz HD did. Now, do I think that my video had any influence over Sega reviving the old games? Yeah. In all seriousness, I doubt my video did anything. It got 300 views. I doubt my own audience cares about it, let alone Sega. But that doesn't change the fact that Sega is reviving old properties, and that caught my attention. So I decided to do what any rational person would do, is buy them all and play them. And since I subjected myself to this, you are now forced to wait. Now just a few disclaimers before we get into this whole thing. I'm going to be talking about the Switch ports of these games, except for the free PS4 exclusive ones, since this is the platform I believe most Sega fans will be buying the games on anyway. It isn't on Xbox, I can tell you that much.
This game is broken!
Another thing is, I'm only referring to the recent Sega revivals from 2019 and onward, and only the ones on actual consoles. No mobile game garbage, since I don't really count that as an actual revival. I'm talking about a full-blown, proper return to the series. Now the first question I might be asked about this trend, which it's weird calling it a trend, would be why Sega decided now of all times to revival these forgotten series. Well, I have a theory. Sonic Forces. Now wait a minute, Sonic Forces sold 5 million copies, and some people on Twitter said it was the best one, so how could this be the case? Well, although this game was a financial success, it was very unpopular with the majority of the Sonic fanbase. And it's painful seeing Sonic be so mediocre while the other Sega properties are being reduced to definitely not butchered interpretations of themselves in the form of the custom avatar costumes. By peeking through a Sega Samurai report looking forward to 2017 and beyond, it mentions that there was a shift in management, combined with one of the key points of packaged games being specifically to quote, revive major intellectual properties. Now I'm not gonna say that this game served as a main contributor for them actually going through with these plans, since it seemed like they already planned on expanding the IPs, but well, all I'm saying is it's been 5 years and Sonic Frontiers still hasn't been released, and Sega's financial situation is completely up in the air, so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if Sonic had forced them to reconsider their business strategy. They've been putting all of their eggs in one basket for far too long, so it wouldn't hurt to test the waters and see what franchises still sell. With that being said, let's start with the black sheep of the collection, brought to us by the same people who released that chicken game on the PS5, Taxi Chaos. Now immediately, this being included might be a bit odd. Taxi Chaos isn't a Sega developed title, this is a spiritual successor to the Crazy Taxi franchise. Why talk about some random indie game? Well, as it turns out, Sega actually published the title in Japan, so I count that as an endorsement. And when else am I gonna talk about this game? So starting out the game, we agreed with something very special. A loading screen. And not just any loading screen, a crazy loading screen. 1 minute and 3 seconds of intense anticipation coursing through my veins, so extreme that I can feel myself succumbing to the insanity, but probably not in the way the developers intended. Getting into the menu, we have 3 modes on offer: Arcade, Pro Mode, and Free Roam. Let's start with the Arcade mode since that's the real meat of the game. We have the choice between 2 characters, and rather than each one having their own unique cars like in Crazy Taxi, you have a menu full of cars to unlock instead, which is a nice touch, giving some reward for repeated gameplay aside from just a score on the leaderboard. Sounds great. Let's experience the chaos that this game has in store.
You know, it's faster if you go by Fifth Avenue.
It's Crazy Taxi, alright? You see people standing in a circle with a colored marker above them to represent distance. You park near them to pick them up, then drive to the destination within the given time, with an arrow on top of the screen to help guide you to the location. The faster you are, the more time and money you earn. Try to get as many people to their destinations as possible within the time limit. Classic arcade gameplay. This game obviously stays very close to its original formula, and it even has a jump from Crazy Taxi 2, which is a nice touch. Unfortunately, because this game's very exploitable combo system, you could literally just go to the destination and spam jump in order to get a frankly ridiculous combo. But you see, I'm actually a master at this game, since if you drive against the wall and spam jump, you can get big money. The next mode is Pro Mode, which is the same as Arcade Mode except you don't have the arrow at the top of the screen, so you have to rely on the location name and image the game gives you. Naturally, this mode is more challenging in Arcade, since it relies more on you knowing the map, but thankfully the green box that appears on the location is still there, so it's still fairly playable. Finally, the last mode is Free Roam, so it serves more as an area to practice the gameplay and mechanics and a mode you would actually play for fun. Yeah, Taxi Chaos is pretty similar to Crazy Taxi, but there is something I noticed the more I played this. I began to get a sensation known as boredom and a sense of disappointment, and I wasn't really sure why at first. I mean, this is a Crazy Taxi, right? I like Crazy Taxi. Why didn't this click for me? I was curious, so I decided to boot up the original Crazy Taxi to find out.
You're gonna love this.
It finally hit me what was missing, the energy. There is something to be said about how crazy Crazy Taxi really is. It isn't just a basic delivery game, it's a Crazy Taxi. Its unrivaled chaotic gameplay is some of the most fun arcade game experiences I've ever had. The way you fly through the streets at insane speeds while that late 90s punk rock blasts in your ears, it's perfection. It adds that perfect energy that you need when you destroy half of San Francisco driving some guy to church. In contrast, Taxi Chaos feels really flat. You have a really slow acceleration for some reason, and your top speed is actually really slow as well. For a game of chaos in the title, it's pretty tame honestly. As for the music, I mean, it sounds pretty good if this was a Game Boy Advance roller rink game. What's also missing is the memorable cast of characters. In Crazy Taxi there is BD Joe, Axel, and the ones that no one uses, who all spelled out one-liners, BD Joe especially.
Party time.
Compare this to Taxi Chaos, we have these two posers that barely say anything in this game, and when they do it's such riveting dialogue as, all in a day's work. Wow, interesting. They weren't even animated in an interesting way. Half the time they just stare forward looking dead inside. Honestly, I might think they weren't even paying attention to the road.
All in a day's work.
The biggest thing missing from this game, and I can't believe I even mentioned it yet, is Crazy Box. This was the best part of the console ports of Crazy Taxi. Crazy Box, or Triangle and X for the sequels, for those of you who do not know, was a mode where it was a series of challenges you had to complete within a set amount of time, which not only were extremely fun, but they also acted as a tutorial to learn some of the deeper mechanics of the game, like drifting and the Crazy Boost. If you complete a row of these challenges, you even unlock the harder one that makes you truly master the mechanics of the game in order to complete. Woo! It's a very rewarding and overall great little side mode. Unfortunately, all mechanics that are usually taught here are completely gone in Taxi Chaos. Drifting, gone. Quick parking, gone. The only one that sort of returns is the boost, but it's been so downgraded that it's not even useful really. The original boost was a risk versus reward mechanic that gave players a nearly instant speed boost if they managed to properly input it without losing speed, which helped gain momentum quickly after stopping and made you zoom across the map even faster, to make some of the tighter time windows for destinations possible if you were skilled enough. Taxi Chaos's version requires zero skill and can only be done at a standstill, which has a very slow acceleration and takes forever to slow down if you happen to be in a boost. So if there is a passenger you want to get to that's near the destination you just came from, your only option is to slowly drive towards them or just ram into a wall next to them and hope that you stop. The arcade mode is also complete garbage since it's just a set timer and that's it. Picking up customers and getting a good clear time does nothing to actually increase the timer, so it's so much harder to rack up a lot of customers and get a good score. Even if the customer's timer in a game shows like 40 seconds or whatever, if the in-game timer runs out, then that's it, the round is over. Which kind of ruins any of the original arcade fun it could have had despite the weaker mechanics. All of this combined make Taxi Chaos become a very slow and boring slog. Whenever I play arcade mode in Crazy Taxi Original, I can get over a dozen people on a good run. In Taxi Chaos, I'll get maybe 5 or 6 if I'm lucky. On top of that, the Switch port of this game runs like trash. It looks like it's 480p the entire time, and the game has several frame rate hiccups, which are even worse in portable mode. Yeah, that weird frame rate? That's not the video, that's the game. What a joke. The signature questionably patented arrow doesn't even work correctly either, since the game seems to point you in whatever random direction it sees fit, only snapping in the correct direction once you've already passed the turn, requiring you to slow and waste even more time. This game really is a massive disappointment, and before you try to say that I'm being too harsh on a small team of developers, Crazy Taxi on Steam cost $8. How much do you think Taxi Chaos costs? 35. Yes, 35 whole USD on the Switch. Almost the price of a mid-tier game from a major dev team. Yeah, this game is unforgivable. The worst part is that the Steam version of this game is actually $10 cheaper, which is still way too much, but that means they're charging more for this broken port, which is actually downright diabolical. And to make things even worse, after the game release, Sega publicly stated that they never had any involvement with this game. They straight up lied to promote their game, also meaning I wasted my entire time! In fact, it makes me so mad that for the rest of this video, I'm going to use the Crazy Taxi license ranks for each game. This game is not very good, please don't buy it. These devs understand Crazy Taxi is about as well as the publishers can spell its name on their website.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class E license. No, not good enough. You need some practice.
Remember Banana Blitz HD? That one game that was the least close to when my Monkey Ball 1 video released, so I suggested that people buy it.
Banana Blitz HD is coming out.
And when it finally released, I made that one first impressions video and never talked about it ever again on this channel. There was a reason for that. I was dreading the day I had to talk about this game again, but here we go, I guess. As you might know, I'm a fan of the Super Monkey Ball series, so when it was announced that after a 7-year-long gap that they would be remaking Banana Blitz, I wasn't exactly thrilled. Now why is that? Because after having a spectacular series of games on the previous generations of consoles, well, mostly, Amusement Vision, the developers behind the original 2 games, were disbanded. When the series went to Wii, the team that remained decided to reboot the series, leading to Super Monkey Ball Banana Blitz, and honestly one of the worst games I've ever played. Cheap motion controls, a simplified and less appealing art style, and an overabundance of mediocre minigames are just few of the many issues with this game. But to get to the point, they essentially took everything that worked about the original entries and changed them for the worse. So when the entire Monkey Ball community saw that this was going to be the game that they decided to remake, it seemed like an insult. Now I am aware that we have Banana Mania now, and I could kind of count that one for this video, but you do have to remember that this was the first Monkey Ball anything we got for close to 7 years if you don't count Bounce. And that game is, So this was most likely many people's first Monkey Ball experience due to that fact. However, the one thing I will give this remake credit for is that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. They did take time to address some of the more glaring issues, like the motion controls being removed and the 50 minigames being cut down to 10. It did appear like the developers did try to make this as good as they could. But unfortunately, some games just aren't able to be saved. Banana Blitz's problems are much deeper than just the motion controls. The fundamental design philosophy behind this game is what really kills it. Mainly the integration of the jump when it comes to level design. Being able to jump, combined with the more imprecise motion controls, leads to levels that are either so easy that they're boring, or so awkward and difficult that you question if they were even properly tested. And adding joystick controls isn't enough to fix that. It doesn't help that the Switch version in particular tends to drop the jump input, which can be extremely frustrating.
It ate my freaking A input.
Unfortunately, this is the problem that Banana Blitz HD faces as a whole. Like with the minigames, cutting down the 50 awful minigames to 10 might sound like a welcome change, and it very well could have been, but instead of getting 10 of the best minigames, we just got 10 minigames that either barely control correctly or just plain boring. At the same time, really good Banana Blitz minigames like Monkey Wars are gone, alongside the legacy minigames like Monkey Golf and Monkey Race. Why is that? High scores. You see, rather than port over the games that would require a fair amount of effort to fix with joystick controls, they opted instead to pick the minigames that required the least amount of effort to port in, and then just threw them all in a newly added decathlon mode as a way to add some value to these. But since the minigames they ported aren't very good, this becomes a mode that barely anyone would want to play. But they kept Monkey Target, you know, the worst one. The same can be said about the new Time Attack mode, which is a way to add a mode that resembles classic Monkey Ball, but unfortunately any fun that would have been possible was completely ruined by the bosses from story mode still being present, which puts a giant roadblock in the enjoyment this mode could have had. Banana Blitz HD is a really poor way to bring back Super Monkey Ball. It is one of the worst games in the series, and despite making some genuine improvements that put it above the original, this game's 6-month development period made any attempt at fixing this game ultimately futile. The glaring flaws in this game are hard to ignore, and honestly made Monkey Ball fans more cautious about the future of the series rather than excited. I think the issue with this remake is best exemplified by a quote from the Banana Blitz episode of the EE podcast, which you should totally check out, by the way, if you like Monkey Ball. Shameless plug.
I think Jeff made an excellent point about it being alienating long term, because I've personally had the experience where I'll have friends like bring up Monkey Ball to me because they know I like Monkey Ball, and they're like, oh hey, like that game seems fun, I want to play it. And I'm like, well, what do you have? And they're like, I have a Switch. And I'm like, ah, jeez. I want to recommend it so badly because it's my favorite franchise, but it feels so bad because I'm like, I don't want that to be someone's first impression of Monkey Ball. Especially like if they hear about it and they're like, oh, like Monkey Ball has cool party game. Like I'd love to play like all these like cool party games multiplayer, because Banana Blitz, as we've already mentioned, is maybe the worst example of party games in the entire series.
Oh,
the
for
HD
sure.
version even more so because there's less of them.
But at the end of the day, I will give it this small amount of credit. I did actually have some fun with this game, which is more than I can say about Taxi Chaos, but seriously, just play Banana Mini instead, it's so much better.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class D license. I can't believe it. Was that your best? I don't think so.
Poor Panzer Dragoon. No one cares about you. This game is unique from the previous two since I had essentially zero expectations going in, since I only very vaguely knew what the series was beforehand. Starting out the game to give me a bit of background with an opening cutscene to explain the plot. To sum it up, our character decides to explore a cave before getting attacked, and is saved at the last second by the Panzer Dragoon. But the rider is fatally wounded by the encounter, and entrusts our hero to stop the ever Dragoon from reaching some evil base thing before we do. I didn't pay attention that much, but that was mainly since the cutscenes, particularly in the Switch version, seem to run at a pretty low frame rate, which takes a bit to get used to. Also, despite the better graphics, it still looks a bit off in the actual animation. This is likely due to the small team this game had, but honestly, comparing it to the original Saturn cutscene, it's still a huge improvement on the presentation. So I'll just eat my words and move on to the title screen. I really like the cracked stone around the logo, and the silhouette of the Dragoon that appears is also a very nice touch. Honestly, I have faith in this being good, so let's boot up a level and see how it plays. Starting up the first level, you get a look at the graphics, and honestly it looks great, well, you know, for a Switch game. And if you compare this to the original, it's a definite upgrade. The area feels so much more live and detailed. This game even features a photo mode, which is how you know they're proud of the graphics, so I do appreciate the inclusion. Another thing you'll discover is that the game runs at a mostly consistent 60 FPS on the Switch version, which is a big positive for me. This does come at the cost of the resolution, but this is the Switch, so that's kind of a given. Second party Switch games struggle to even reach a consistent 30 because Nintendo refuses to make a Switch Pro, and so you know what, I'll take what I can get at this point. There does exist a performance mode and a graphics mode in the options, but honestly you have just as good of a guess of what impact it has on the game than I would, since I could not tell a single difference while playing. Moving on to the gameplay, this game is an on-rail shooter. You can think of series like Star Fox, which is very similar to gameplay-wise. But you see the series are very different. In Star Fox you fly around and shoot in a straight line in a spaceship. While in Panzer Dragoon, you fly around and shoot in a straight line, but you're a Dragoon. Also, it's not furry bait.
No!
Alright, that's not all that's unique to Panzer Dragoon. For example, you can look in all 4 directions rather than being locked to one. This adds an extra level of strategy to the combat, since you'll need to turn to account for enemies moving around you. Although this is mainly useful during boss fights and isn't actually used that much during the actual levels. Nonetheless, it's a really interesting mechanic that adds some minor depth to the gameplay. Another thing I really like about this game is that it's challenging. If you don't pay attention, you'll likely die a fair amount in some of these stages. I barely beat some of these stages by the skin of my teeth, and I was playing on normal. I'm not sure whether or not this was because of the actual game design or because the charge shot is a useless mechanic against tougher enemies, but it was nice having to learn how to utilize the mechanics at my disposal and actually overcome a threat. As you may be able to tell, I like this game a fair amount, but not everything about it works. Starting with one that I already mentioned, I found that the charge shot is a lot more useful against the smaller enemies in Panzer Dragoon, since you can walk on the more than one enemy at once, which you can't do in Star Fox. Although for the most part, it's actually not that useful against the boss enemies, which makes those much harder as a result. A lot of the time, I find that I can do more damage just by using the normal shots fast enough. So when I play, I end up setting my controller down and using 2 fingers on the shooting buttons like I'm playing an arcade game. Another thing I found to be really odd are the gyro controls. If you don't know already, I like to use gyro aiming in Switch games when available. I think it's a really good mechanic, and I think it adds a lot to console shooters in general. So when I saw it in the options menu, I obviously turned it on. Unfortunately, the thing I found is that the motion controls don't work correctly at all. Instead of moving the cursor in a smooth motion like you would expect, it's just straight up broken. This game seems to try to emulate D-pad movement or something, I don't know. I've tried to use multiple controllers, but no, it's just broken. This is actually footage of me trying to use the motion aiming. This isn't the biggest deal breaker in the world, but it is a clear mistake that I find odd. I guess you would have to go with the Steam version to use proper gyro, which is a huge shame. Another thing that bothered me is that there isn't any way to dodge. Alright, that's not entirely accurate. There actually is a way to dodge, but only when you're in low health. But nowhere in the entire game are you taught this. No hint screen message, no tutorial pop-up, not even in the control screen. You are expected to figure it out on your own, which sounds kind of dumb when you think about it. Hiding mechanics like this is a secret. Granted, this isn't required to beat the game, but not knowing this does make the game more difficult, so it's a bit scummy to not hint towards it in any way. I had to find out through the Nintendo Switch news section, which is not how your players should have to figure out mechanics like this. The biggest, most glaring issue with this game, however, is the length. This game only has 6 levels, and they aren't particularly long either. You could probably beat the whole thing in about 2 hours, and for the $25 asking price, that could be considered a bit steep for some. This game does soften the blow with a bonus mode you unlock after clearing the game called Pandora's Box, which allows you to select any level you want and play it with a few modified settings like faster speed or infinite health, which is a nice distraction, but ultimately the game's length is its biggest flaw by far. If I'm being honest, I do like this game, but I don't love it. There was a lot here to enjoy, especially if you like games like Star Fox to any extent, but the short length and the every issues I mentioned brings this game down. I will still recommend this one despite its issues. Although the official Panzer Dragoon Twitter account hinted at a Panzer Dragoon 2 remake releasing, so hopefully they can fix all the issues with this remake in the next one. Editor's note, it's been a little bit since the first game released, and we still don't have an update on the sequel, so I guess take that information with a grain of salt.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Classy Try it again.
The next game is Virtua Fighter 5, The Ultimate Showdown. This is a new edition of Virtua Fighter 5, but this time remade in the Yakuza Dragoon engine. Did I say Dragoon again? This was originally announced during the 2020 Tokyo Game Show, and as you can imagine, it was met with overwhelming praise.
Fuck Virtua Fighter.
Another thing to note is that this was also announced and released as I was working on this video. Sega, you have— First things first, I have to come clean. I'm not really a fighting game person. I don't think that comes as much of a surprise, but it bears mentioning. My only real experience with this franchise as a whole was playing Virtua Fighter 4 on my PS2 a long time ago, which I do like since that game oozes Y2K, especially in the menu. Yeah, that's the good stuff. While loading up Virtua Fighter 5, it becomes real apparent that this is indeed a game in the Virtua Fighter game franchise, alright? The first thing you see when entering the menu is a screen to the right that plays a battle between what I assume is two CPU players. This game definitely is focusing on the online content rather than the single player, with all the solo stuff being in tiny boxes on the bottom of the screen, which makes a lot of sense. Fighting games are primarily a competitive genre, which makes it very suitable for online. With that being said, my internet is borderline worse than dial-up connections, so the majority of what I played for this video was single player. So how did that go? That same 3D fighting gameplay the series is known for is intact, and I'm still not great at it. If you don't know what these games are, it's sort of like Street Fighter if you could also move around your opponent instead of just being in a 2D line. Wow, Ninja, you mean the 3D fighting game series is in 3D? Yes, alright. Talking about the combat feel in a fighting game is like me talking about the deep lore of Chicken Shoot for the Wii. The point being, I'm great at it. One thing I can talk about is the graphics, which honestly look very, very good for the most part. Just going off of comparisons between this and Final Showdown, the previous version of VF5, the Dragoon engine definitely made this game look significantly better than the original. Honestly, the only parts of this game that look off are the few 2D background elements that are presumably retained from the past version. But if you actually touch grass every once in a while, then this shouldn't bother you too much. Otherwise, it looks very nice.
I can't believe they made the Minecraft grass into a real life thing.
But yeah, when it comes to combat, it feels good to play. I had a fair amount of fun playing arcade mode, even if I got absolutely destroyed by the later opponents. What is here seems like a good fighting game. I should probably watch some other people play this to get a better opinion on it. Well, thankfully one of the main features of this game is the ability to create and join rooms, sort of like the arenas from Smash Bros. Ultimate, except not garbage. When watching matches online, you can react to what is happening with preset messages or little emojis, which is a nice touch. I like this aspect of the game a lot. I'm not sure if it's a standard across modern fighting games, but if not, then it should be. On a somewhat related note, when the game launched, it was released alongside a DLC pack containing a ton of outfits for characters, more emojis for spectator mode, and 180 songs from the previous game. But most importantly, skins for every character based on the original Virtua Fighter models. Now, I could very easily hate this decision, since having legacy content like this locked away behind DLC in any game is always super annoying and very transparently a cash grab to me. Now, granted, the DLC itself is actually really neat, and seeing the realistic backgrounds with super low poly character models is absolutely amazing to behold. The game with the DLC pack is $30 either way, so honestly I think it's worth the value, so I can't be too mad at it. They even later made new DLC with the Yakuza characters, which is pretty amusing and probably what people would want in a game like this. But yeah, as far as I never play fighting games, McGee over here can tell, Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown is a good game with a nice budget price. Bear in mind I didn't actually play this online, so I have no idea how good the netcode, any of that technical knowledge I don't know is, but the actual game itself from a mechanical and graphical standpoint was excellent. I like this one, and I'm sure if I'm wrong there will be many people telling me in the comments.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class A license. You played pretty cool, but there's one more step to the top. Think you can get there?
Guys, I have to come clean about something. I don't like beat 'em up games. I didn't think I'd have to make a YouTube apology so early.
I've made a severe and continuous.
Well, I should probably rephrase that. I didn't like beat 'em up games. I'm a changed man. For those of you who do not know the history of Streets of Rage 4, it was originally going to be a 2.5D rendition of the series on the Dreamcast until it was scrapped due to, get this, Sega of America not knowing what Streets of Rage was, so they scrapped it. Its existence was in limbo for years until Guard Crush Games, people who actually know how to make beat 'em ups, got the go-ahead by Sega to make this very game. Now personally, when I had played the Streets of Rage games on various Genesis collections, I actually wasn't much of a fan of the original trilogy, which I know must sound like I'm committing an actual crime. I like them in an arcade environment, but I've never really wanted to sit down and play one on any given day. Every time I had played one in the past, I ended up either getting bored by the repetitive nature of the gameplay, or I would just rather play a normal stage-by-stage platformer. My experience with games I actually like in a genre pretty much begins and ends with the GameCube Teen Titans game, which should be pretty telling of my willingness to play these. Getting back on topic, I went into this game with an open mind since I had heard about how much the community adored this game. So with that, what do I think of this entry? It's really fun. I can't really fully explain what about this specific one made me love it so much when compared to the previous entries, but I'll at least try my best to explain. What makes this game click for me? Well, remember when I said earlier about the gameplay being repetitive and boring? Yeah, well scratch that, because apparently I'm a fucking idiot. Okay, yes, the gameplay is very repetitive in the fact that you do fight similar enemies over and over again with similar moves, unless you use a different character. But the part about it being unfun, well, I'm not sure if I'm just better at games these days or something, but the gameplay loop is pretty fun. The main source of enjoyment and biggest challenge of the game is maintaining control over the enemies. It can be very easy to get overwhelmed when there's even 2 enemies on screen, let alone 5 or 6. So you have to master the controls to fully overcome each level. The more you understand how to defeat each enemy type, the more satisfying clearing a room becomes. Now, the thing that I think makes the gameplay loop go from good to great are the items. Now, as much as you may think that you can win every fight with a jump kick and a trash can chicken, what might end up saving you in the end are the weapons that you can steal from the enemies. These are super satisfying to use due to the higher damage output, and become infinitely useful since you can throw them at the enemies that get a range attack, which can help greatly when trying to zone the enemies around you in order to clear a room easier. The game really feels like you have a lot of options to choose from, which helps it from feeling too stale even after long play sessions. That being said, if you're on high alert, you can very easily get cornered and get absolutely pummeled. The enemies are just as vicious as someone who heard that you don't like the Streets of Rage games. The bosses aren't pushovers by any means either. I just barely defeated the first boss when I was playing this game for the first time. Knowing when to run up and fight and when to back off and play defensive is imperative to succeeding. The only thing more impressive than the game are the graphics. Wow, are they stunning. The original Genesis graphics are great in their own, don't get me wrong, but in my opinion they're generically Genesis and aren't particularly memorable. But on the other hand, the comic book style this game went with is perfect for the series. It's super stylized, very detailed, and is the most logical step forward the series can take. And for a Switch game in particular, it looks fantastic. In fact, not to spoil anything, but it's probably the best looking game on this list. I was honestly surprised by how much fun I had with this one. And since I was curious, I decided to replay some Streets of Rage 2 just to see if maybe 4 was the only one that was good. And no, that game was equally as fun, so I guess I've just been living under a rock this whole time. I find it really impressive that this game managed to keep me entertained despite playing it solo the entire time, since this genre really benefits from having a buddy to play with. I really want to talk more about this game, but I would just start devolving into rambling about nothing, so I think I'll just say that Streets of Rage 4 is good, so play it.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class S license. Man, that was amazing driving. I'm sure you're gonna come by and show it to me again sometime, right? Here we go.
I need help with something.
I have nothing to say to a stranger.
Can I talk to you about something?
Shenhua, what's up?
This is Leo. He's a friend of mine.
I'm looking for Wong Wen.
I have nothing to say to a stranger.
Oh no, not this one. So if you aren't familiar with the Shenmue franchise, let me summarize it for you. Take a Yakuza game, then remove any part of the game that's actually fun and well designed. Then you have Shenmue. Alright, that's not entirely fair. The first Shenmue game was very influential and important to gaming history, especially when it comes to storytelling and graphics. It was very impressive for its day. The cutscenes and story are well animated and tell an actually deep and compelling narrative, you know, for the time. The Shenmue games have earned their status as a beloved piece of gaming history. But if you ever try to play one of these games today, the game design elements that hold these games together have aged worse than a carton of milk sunbathing in the Sahara Desert. The voice acting in particular, which some fans actually enjoy as some kind of in-joke, completely ruins any sense of immersion that the game might have had at some point.
Hey.
Wanna play with me?
Shenmue games are just bloated, boring, poorly voice-acted real-life simulators. Very antiquated examples of genres that later grew to surpass the original game, at least in my opinion. So you would hope that with Shenmue 3 releasing 18 whole years after the previous entry in the series, that they would update the game to modern standards in order to make a game that's improved in every way, and accessible to a modern audience. Well, wouldn't you believe that they made it worse in every possible way? You see this here? This is Shenmue 3. Are you having fun? Well, I hope you said yes, since you can experience exhilarating gameplay such as talking to villagers, and just to switch it up on you, you can talk to more villagers. I cannot stress enough about how repetitive and nothing the gameplay in this supposed video game is. It helps that the villagers are more than willing to assist you in your quest.
Have you seen Mr. Yuan?
Do I look like I'd know anything about that?
I'm looking for Mr. Yuan.
Go ask one of the other kids running around.
Have you seen Mr. Yuan?
I'm sorry, dear, but could you save that for later?
The goal of the game is supposed to be to get information in order to locate a man that killed your father. But in order to get that information, you need to either talk to villagers or fight people in order to get them to talk. But the problem is that Ryu is very weak, so you have to train. But as you get your butt kicked trying to train in order to gain power, you lose health obviously, and you train a lot, so you need to keep buying health items in order to train more. So how do you make money? By doing everybody else's chores? Which will get you a little bit of money. So you do this stupid wood chopping minigame a few times, which will take a fairly lengthy amount of time. Then you buy my health items, use them, then train more. But wait, there's more. You also drain health just by walking around and by doing the balancing minigame, which you need in order to gain more stamina for the fight. So you end up needing to do the minigame even more in order to compensate for that. Not to mention that every single time you need to get healing items, you have to walk all the way across the village every single time, draining your health. So when you reach a roadblock in the training, which is very possible since the fighting mechanics are absolute delayed garbage, you end up getting stuck in a particularly difficult fight, losing, and then having to do the balancing minigame several times to get more energy, which wastes even more health items, and then you have to walk all the way back to the woodchuck minigame 50 times for money every single time. So you then buy more health items and walk all the way across the village to the fighting area, lose again, then balance, then chop more wood, then walk more, then fight, then lose, then balance, then chop more wood, then buy more items, all the time having to listen to
I won't allow it! Eat my fist!
What's wrong with you?
until you finally win the fight required to progress in the story. Wow, great. What do I get to do now? Oh, talk to more villagers. This game is absolute trash, even by Shenmue standards. Never play it unless you really want to experience it for yourself, but I highly don't recommend it, since it doesn't even progress the Shenmue story at all, which is supposed to be the whole reason fans are willing to put up with the mundane gameplay in the first place.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class E license. No, not good enough. You need some practice.
Hey there, Space Cats. Ooh la la here, coming at you from Spaceport 9. Tonight I'm investigating reports that aliens have invaded and are forcing people to dance.
Out of all the games I played for this video, this was the one I was the most excited to try out beforehand. It wasn't as much because I like Space Jam 5, which I do, but more because I had an excuse to use my PlayStation VR again. VR as a gaming medium is very unique in its sense of immersion, which sounds like an obvious statement, like yeah, it's literally called virtual reality. But something about feeling that you're actually in the game world is so special. I mean, come on guys, I'll finally be able to meet Ulala. And what could be better?
That's not good.
This game comes to us thanks to Grounding Inc., who was formed by a director that previously worked with Sega. That's right, the guy who directed Panzer Dragoon? Wait, what? Yeah, the Space Channel 5 director seemed to have no involvement with this one, and neither did the Panzer Dragoon director either. Odd. They did bring back some game designers and artists based on what I could find, so key members did return for this game, which sadly didn't seem to be the case for many of the other games in this video, so I do appreciate that this one went the extra mile. First loading into the game, you end up in this cozy looking space pod with a very calming little song in the background, which I cannot find on YouTube, which bothers me greatly. There isn't too much going on here besides a window where you can see a ship fly by, but I like this room. It feels really immersive just being able to vibe in this little space pod before you get to the main game. In front of you there are multiple menu options, but for the sake of time I'm going to solely focus on the story mode. You start the game by scanning in your arms. It'll require your reporter attire, which is actually a full model instead of just being floating hands like most VR games, so that's pretty novel. Now naturally my first reaction to seeing something like this is to immediately try to mangle up the character model in a hilarious fashion, which probably proves why games like this don't usually use full models. After a quick tutorial with Willa, hey Willa, you get to play the first level of the game, which is a remake of the very first level of the original Space Channel 5, just all confined to the first area since you can't really move around a lot in VR. I will say it's really entertaining comparing the original dynamic camera angles of the intro to the opening cutscene of this game where you're just kind of standing around waiting for Willa to walk past you in order to start the level, but not quite close enough to touch. Darn those Sony sensors.
You missed the target.
Anyway, if you're familiar with how Space Jam 5 plays, then this game should be pretty self-explanatory. The opponent, which is most likely a Moorian, will move in a direction with a pose, then you have to copy that pose using your two PlayStation Move controlled arms. The only real difference is that there are some added poses and dodging that add more variety to the movement. And since this is a VR game, there's going to be way more leeway in order to make the game more reasonably difficult for the player. There were more than a few instances where I probably should have lost a heart, but somehow the move counted. One thing that has definitely benefited by VR is the dodge move. Actually having to physically dodge attacks is so cool and encourages you to be active. At the same time, it makes the boss enemies way more terrifying, which I do think is a plus. This also doubles as the way to make you look hilarious to anyone else in the room, which I would say is a good feature.
Hey!
Moving on, as far as the story goes, if you're expecting there to be more in the like 10-second video clips that play between the different stages, then you will be very disappointed. Not that the game has no plot really, it's just that it's so minimal that it feels like it has no plot, which isn't much better to be honest. It's basically just a slightly altered retelling of the original Space Channel 5 story, except with like 1/4 of the actual content. After the opening mission of the game, you're greeted by a new variant of the crewmate, Mororian, called the Evermoro, which is a white and red design that I think looks super good. The Evermoro are unique since they're actually able to speak to the player in English. Granted, it's only used for the sake of setting up a sick dab for the player to do. Which means that this VR spin-off game somehow adds more lore to the franchise than the entirety of Shenmue 3. Alright, I'll stop mentioning that game. After defeating the group, you move on to level 3, where you meet up with the Jaguars, who of course want to have a dance-off. So naturally, that's most of the level's gameplay. Well, you know, besides getting hit by an asteroid, which is way more terrifying than it might seem. At the end of the level, an alien spaceship that suspiciously looks like a fidget spinner starts to suck up Ulala on the player. And it's just this genuinely emotional moment where Ulala passes her microphone over before she gets overwhelmed by the void behind her. Ulala, no! She died. Honestly, it's just a good scene and probably the best part of the entire game. Although any emotional impact this would have is somewhat ruined since the level after this is the final level of the game. Not even kidding. Where you team up with Jaguar to save everyone using the power of dancing. Then after that, there are the credits where you get to high-five the cast members of the game, except for Ulala. I'm fine. Like I said earlier, this game's plot is pretty one note, all things considered. It's clear that the main focus of the game was just to be a VR tech demo rather than a full new entry to the series. Even with that being said, there only being 4 whole levels, which are very short mind you, does make this one hard to sell. It feels like right when the game is actually getting started, it just kind of ends. The original Space Channel 5 had 4 levels as well, but those were really long and difficult as hell, so it felt a lot more like a complete game, since it would most likely take a lot longer to finish. The game also switched locations in order to add a lot of variety, so this game being just 4 singular rooms really feels like a downgrade. My only guess as to why it was made this way is to prevent people from getting tired from playing each level for too long, but they could have just doubled the stage count in order to compensate for this. It also would have helped to fix the non-existent story, since the new Mororians really aren't explained at all. For a sequel at least a while after the previous game, this is a really huge disappointment honestly. It takes roughly 30 minutes to beat the main story, so unless you're a hardcore Space Channel 5 fan already, then whether or not you'll get any value out of this entry will probably be very subjective. Personally, I had fun with the story mode since I already liked the previous game, so this felt like a fun addendum, but if you had never played one of these before, then I would imagine you would be even more confused by how little single player content there is. To the game's credit, there are some other modes you can try out, like a hard mode for some replay value, although I doubt most people would continue playing long enough to care. But the best mode in the game by far is the 100 stage dance battle mode, which is an endurance test that has you go through several different poses, and the goal is to try to remember each and keep up with it for the whole 100 stages. It gets fairly difficult, and is definitely the most replayable aspect of this game by far. It turns a little novelty game into a memory test, and honestly I think this is the real hook to point the game. That being said, a lot of these poses are kind of a stretch, like the Wolf and Jaguar are almost identical. There are also 2 poses named after car brands, which is pretty amusing.
When I say Toyota, that's the pose. Toyota, is this car now? Toyota, Toyota, Toyota.
This mode is really fun, and that signature Space Channel 5 goofiness really carries the appeal of this mode so much further than it did in the story mode. As far as the other modes go, there is a model viewer that has descriptions of every character in the game, which they bother to give a unique description for each Mororian color, which is pretty amusing. Other than that, there is a viewing mode, which allows you to view each level as a bystander, so you can have that extra level of immersion to the gameplay.
Focus, focus!
Lastly, there is an arcade mode, which I think is mainly meant for competing with another player, but I don't really know what the purpose is overall. But the one main reason someone would care about arcade mode is for the Hatsune Miku DLC they released for $5. Yes, this is real. It's just a redo of the first level but with a dark aesthetic, and Miku is the host of channel 39 and she gets to wear an Ulala style outfit, which is honestly pretty amazing. The level isn't really anything to write home about, but it does add some time to the playthrough, and you do get the high-five Miku at the end, so that's pretty cool I guess. Overall, Space Channel 5 VR may just be a glorified VR tech demo, but it's a tech demo I had fun with. Space Channel 5 is a great series and VR is honestly such a good fit for it, and despite the pretty abysmal length of the story mode, I did not regret my $25 purchase in the slightest. I really hope that they continue to make more of these VR Space Channel 5 games, or any Space Channel 5 games for that matter, since I'd love to play more of them, just hopefully with significantly more content. I get the impression that the team behind these truly care about the IP, and you can tell even just by the visuals, which perfectly update the Dreamcast aesthetic while improving it to the standards of the hardware, to the point where it's pretty hard to tell the differences between what the two are from a glance. I really do want to give this game a higher score than I will, but the lack of content really hurts this one. But if you have a PlayStation VR, or any VR for that matter, then I can pretty safely recommend this one.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. to play it safe, huh? Come back next time and show us your best.
ToeJam and Earl is a series, I think. Honestly, I'd barely heard of the series before. I knew the name since I'd heard it in Sega circles before, but outside of that, nothing. The only way I knew it was revived was through the existence of an official Twitter account. Now, normally I wouldn't bring up something like this since it isn't particularly relevant when it comes to game revivals. Like, obviously they're gonna try to use social media to promote their product. Gotta take up as much space in people's cranium as possible as they doom scroll away their free time. However, the ToeJam and Earl Twitter is something else. I don't know how many people actually remember this, but a few years ago, this Twitter earned a reputation by being as out of character as a brand Twitter can possibly be. It was genuinely unhinged, and that's not an exaggeration. They would tweet the usual promotional stuff that you would expect, and then out of the blue, you would just see furry fanfiction just on the timeline for everyone to see. It was a crazy time. The most infamous tweet of the bunch was this one, and needless to say, it was later deleted. But honestly, I miss this era of the account. Sure, nowadays it's still a pseudo-personal account disguise, which is funny in its own right, but the chaotic charm has definitely been lessened. Now, why would I sidetrack this video to talk about the Twitter account? Because of course I would. I was not about to leave that unmentioned, but also because the point I was trying to make is that it did make me aware that this game existed, despite everything else. So I guess the advertising worked. What is a ToeJam and Earl game like? Well, I wanted to understand what I was getting into, so I decided to do a quick peek at the original game. It absolutely oozes the 90s. The shades, the backwards cap, the vomit-inducing bright patterns of the background. There was no other decade this could have been produced in. It radiates that radical 90s energy, yeah! That being said, much like nuclear energy, overexposure poses a great threat to one's health, so I will skip the intro and just get to the gameplay. The goal of the game is very simple. You have crash landed on Earth and you have to retrieve your missing ship parts so you can escape. Sounds familiar. The gameplay loop is pretty straightforward, all things considered. It is a 4x4 exploration game. Each floor is fairly spacious and requires a lot of aimless wandering in order to find the next teleporter. Thankfully, there's a map you can pull up, so getting lost isn't too much of an issue. The game will tell you if there's a ship piece on the current floor, which will require much more exploration in order to reach. But otherwise, the goal is to locate the elevator and get the heck out of there in order to hopefully get another ship piece. This is all well and good, but there has to be more to do in each area in order to make going through all of this worth it, right? Well, the main appeal of the game is the present mechanic. Well, as it turns out, Earthlings are actually horrible, disgusting monsters who program some of the most irritating enemies you'll ever face. Whether it be a group of bees, a devil, or a hamster in a ball, they will hunt you down, so you need to defend yourself. How? Well, there are these roads that appear sometimes that allow you to walk faster, but they're nowhere near good enough. We need a force mightier than gods in order to quell these vermin. We need the most powerful weapon ever devised. The presents. Each one you pick up is actually an item you can use, which can either heal you, give you a power-up, and just to mess with the player, some of them can hinder your movement or spawn an enemy just to add some extra excitement for your playthrough. Using these presents isn't exactly as straightforward as it might seem. The wide majority of them are unidentified, meaning it's a complete shot in the dark of what's going to happen. When you're in the heat of the moment, you need to make a decision. Do you run for your life and likely get hit by another foe, or do you test your luck and see if fate's in your hands? So you panic. Oh god, oh god, oh god. Then out of options, you click the use button, convinced that you're already dead, but with the blind optimism of a hero player. Phew. You can also get some extra assistance with a few friendly Earthlings in this game if you give them money, which can heal you or defeat enemies. I didn't really get any use out of these since having to hunt them down can sometimes be more dangerous than just running for the goal, but I suppose they can be useful in harder floors of the game. Overall, the gameplay of this game was pretty alright. It's not quite a super action-filled experience like a Sonic or an Hour. It's more of a comfort kind of game, something you play while vibing to a podcast or the incredible 90s funk of the soundtrack. Seriously, this is some good Genesis goodness. The vibe of this game is also carried over into the humor. It has that 90s sarcastic energy you would expect. I'm a bit mixed on it personally. On one hand, it is very childish in a dumb way, like how you can see ToeJam's butt when he crouches. But on the other hand, there are some things I find really funny, like how if you go idle then the game will literally yell at you. Get out of bed! The original ToeJam and Earl isn't quite my thing, but I can respect it for what it is. Now that I've gone that whole tangent out of the way, let's talk about Back in the Groove. Being led by the person who created the original ToeJam and Earl, which is pretty based, this game still retains the structure of the original. Same level by level roguelike gameplay, same presence, same 90s aesthetic. So what is new about this new one? Well, the humor of the game has been improved in my opinion. Sure, you still have the very childish 90s stuff, which I'm not a fan of, and the root beer present that still makes you burp, which is just as annoying as ever. That being said, it is nowhere near as grating as the noises the enemies make. This game did have moments that I thought were genuinely funny, like a present that spawns a giant "I'm here" sign for the enemies to notice you more. Or when you pick up $1, the game has the exact same reaction I have when I get a new paycheck. Money! Unlike the original Genesis game, the levels are littered with trees, bushes, and houses which you can shake, which is an improvement since it adds more things to interact with in the level, as well as being a source for getting presents. It also doubles as an opportunity for the game to try to drop a bowling ball on your head. Haha, you missed! Something tells me that wasn't intended. Shaking the trees can also spawn a parking meter, which acts as a Korok-style puzzle of chasing them down. And when it's done, it'll either give you money, spawn an enemy, or open up a warp zone to the Hyper Funk Zone, which is a nice minigame distraction from the main game that requires you to dodge obstacles in order to gain XP. It is way more fun than I'd like to admit, and it makes going after the parking meter worth it on its own. But that's kind of sidetracking for the main improvements of the game. For example, now there are a total of 9 playable characters, upgrading from the 6 in the previous game. Every character and enemy are animated with an excessive amount of motion tweening, which looks kind of odd, but I suppose it fits the general hand-drawn art style, but I felt like it was worth mentioning. The enemies and allies have been heavily expanded upon as well. There are now 60 enemies in the game, which sounds like an impressive number on paper, but a majority of the enemies still behave pretty much the same as the original game, and will very easily gang up on you if you aren't careful, so it's best just to stay as far away as possible. I guess the majority of the new enemies just serve to be some kind of visual parody, whether it be phone bad.
The self-run radiation does cause brain tumors.
I will say one aspect that I actually really enjoyed was how the difficulty scales with the amount of floors you clear. For example, you begin to find evil versions of the mailbox and the teleporter, which requires you to pay more attention to your surroundings, otherwise you'll take massive damage, or in the case of the teleporter, you'll be sent 1 floor downwards. It genuinely caught me off guard, and I appreciated how clever it was. The game does give you more options to dodge enemies, thankfully, with the sunflower serving as a way to get enemies to stop chasing you, and the road system from the original returning. I would still say that dodging an enemy chasing you is still borderline impossible unless you get an upgrade. Like, seriously, I am trying absolutely anything to avoid these guys and I'm still get hit. It's garbage. Come on! Speaking of upgrades, there are now significantly more allies of varying usefulness. The worst of these are the ones that just heal you for a certain amount of money, since this game has multiple presents that are just food, and there is a sushi making ally that just gives you food as a present slot, so naturally they become essentially useless. Anyway, Gandhi's in this game, yeah, not a joke. He creates a circle of healing wherever he goes, which is pretty based. Unfortunately, I can't say he is super useful since he acts on his own accord and ends up being stuck in one section of the map, typically not where he would be useful. Now, as far as the good NPCs go, the Wise Men is one that's been in the series since the first game, and will upgrade you once you get enough XP, allowing you to have more health, move faster, and just generally make the game actually playable past 410. But honestly, I didn't care for any everyone except for the dancing minigame one, since it's a fun distraction and gets you XP and money for free. The rest can be useful, like the opera singer that defeats enemies. Besides that, the wide majority of these won't help you too much. Overall, Back in the Groove is a welcoming update to the original game's formula, but it is still not my thing. Walking around can still be quite tedious, and having to go through several floors without a ship hurt is really annoying, and also time consuming. Even with the present mechanic and plenty of enemies at your disposal, you'll take so much damage that you'll never want to get close to enemies given the choice. And I know you're supposed to get a ton of XP by exploring in order to level up, in order to keep up with the scaling difficulty. But unfortunately, I just don't find the exploration in this game to be very fulfilling long term, since it really does feel like busy work most of the time. You pretty much have to force yourself to use presents very often in order to keep things fresh. And I find myself not doing this since most of the time I don't know what they are, and there is a very real chance that I'll get a bad present, one that just puts me in more danger than I was before. So what ends up happening is that you'll just keep playing very samey levels over and over again, with not much gameplay variety aside from it maybe being snow occasionally. Then you finally get a floor for ship part very, very slowly. I had a run where I went for well over an hour, and I'd made it to floor 17 with 4 ship parts, only to accidentally use a present that killed me, leading to a game over and all my progress being for nothing. That was on me, but that was an hour and 17 minutes of progress, and to be honest, I didn't particularly achieve much in that time. The simplicity of the original game is pretty excusable for the time, but with this game, I don't know. It just leaves me kind of bored, even with all the charm on display. As a result, I don't really feel motivated to play this for hours on end, just to see whatever ending cutscene the reward would be. I do think this game is fun and has a place in the roguelike genre, but I don't think it has enough mechanical depth to find myself playing it for a particularly long time. Although you do have to take into account that this is the Switch version, I mean there's gonna be plenty of frame drops. The game seems about as interested in running as I am in playing it. I do understand the appeal of this game at the very least, but I find this one kind of hard to recommend, unless you're already a fan of this genre. Although this game does go on sale fairly often, so honestly, you know what, despite what I've said, get it on sale if you're interested, since this isn't bad for a couple of hours, even if it didn't fully click with me. With that being said, as a revival for ToeJam and Earl, it does the job much better than the majority of the games I've covered. Yeah, I should have expected that.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class B license. Decided to play it safe, huh? Come back next time and show us your best.
Let's get this one over with. Another game that was released after I started writing this video. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Alex Kidd, it was Sega's biggest franchise on the Sega Master System, at least according to VG charts. So remaking this game doesn't seem like that unrealistic of an idea. So if this game does hold up, it should be a great way to introduce new players to the franchise. Since I had purchased this game physically, it ended up being more expensive since it comes with a keychain and a black and white instruction book in order to replicate the Master System. The cartridge is even the red and black look, and the game has a reversible cover that looks like the original horrible graph paper cover, which is a really nice touch that I think adds a lot to the experience. Now, as far as the actual game goes, it's a fairly standard platform at the time. You jump around, punch blocks, and die every second due to unfair enemy placements. Yeah, this is a certified 1980s 2D platformer. At some point, game developers decided that it was a better idea to, instead of designing good levels, to make the level as hard as possible to artificially increase playtime. I'm aware that people like these kinds of games, but I'm personally not too fond of them. Now, thankfully, you can enable an infinite lives option to make the game actually playable, which I do appreciate. Now, the remake obviously redoes all the visuals to make them more modernized and nice. Every level has a lot more detail, and the game looks really good for being a Switch game. They even added new weather effects and details to certain levels just to add more visual variety to the game overall, which is a really good touch. Now, I will say the redesign for Alex Kidd does look awfully familiar. One fun aspect of the remake is that they allow you to choose the different food options when you have a region, so that the food you grab at the end of the level can be whichever one you want.
Being British, I was really concerned about the fact that I wasn't going to be able to connect to this game on an intimate level and get invested in its universe, but now I've seen it's got fish and chips, that's not going to be a problem. Let's go.
The biggest feature that the game offers is that with a hit of a button, you can switch back to the old graphics in order to experience the original version. Although you can just buy the original Alex Kidd for $8 on the Switch, so this feels a bit pointless in the grand scheme of things. Now, unfortunately, a byproduct of this classic mode is that the game is a tile-for-tile remake, which in my opinion is the worst kind of remake. Since when you remake a game, the expectation is that you take the original game and update it to modern standards. But for some games, in order to make the process easier, or laziness I guess, they just take the original and rebuild the entire game with the exact same layout. The problems I have with these types of remakes are, 1. The old layout will almost always clash with the new art style and look really dated. It would be very distracting to the player. And then 2. If the remake is worse in any way, then it defeats the entire point of remaking the game in the first place if you aren't going to properly update it for modern times. And with a game like Alex Kidd, which is from 1986, the level design is more often than not going to not exactly age the best. This game really showcases this problem with the blocks. There are a lot of blocks. Now, this is easy to forgive in 1986, but nowadays there is much more to be expected of video games than to have blocky platformers. A good platformer has more dynamic shapes that feel more like a natural area rather than just a bunch of blocks in the world. Take Super Mario World, where sure there's still blocks, but there's also slopes, moving platforms, and obstacles that make the level feel more like it's in a natural area full of hills, cliffs, and various obstacles put in place by Bowser. In Alex Kidd, however, most levels are very flat, with several square platforms that you must punch through in order to defeat one enemy or get a few coins out of it. When the average Mario Maker level has more going for it than your $30 game, that's not really a good sign. What I'm trying to say is a game like Alex Kidd could have been given better treatment by designing new and dynamic levels based on the original game, which there clearly was some intention to, seeing as they designed beautiful new backgrounds and level themes for the game. If anything, the remake graphics makes the decision even more confusing, since the original graphics at least match the game. In the remake, it really looks like a bad custom level for an Alex Kidd fan game more than anything. The straight line levels are also extremely dull. There is really no variety in the gameplay at all for most of the game. You just go right, and go right, and go right. It gets old extremely quickly. That's probably honestly why the game is so hard. They needed some way to make the game memorable. To the game's credit, there are 2 castle levels in the game, which are actually quite fun. They use a non-linear approach, and you have to go through a maze of sorts to reach the boss. As fun as these are, they are really short-lived when compared to the rest of the experience. Anyway, on the topic of controls, at first I found the controls to be too slippery and the hitboxes to be extremely unforgiving.
How could this happen?
I don't know, maybe those giant ears he has keep scraping the enemies. Thankfully, if you go to the options menu, there is a new control option that makes the game much smoother and forgiving, with hitboxes that aren't utter trash. I appreciate the effort made to have an option for better controls, but that should have been the original option for controls rather than sticking with the unforgiving settings that are akin to the original game. That would be like if they remade a game known for having extremely precise controls, only to make it feel like a trackball instead, which they obviously wouldn't do. I understand that this was done in part because some areas aren't accessible with the improved controls, but this really shows why making a tile-for-tile remake is more trouble than it's worth. I think the biggest example of what I'm talking about is Jenkins Castle, one of the final levels of the game and the worst offender when it comes to bad level design. You're playing the fortress, it's actually pretty fun until you reach this room. Seriously? A small room full of tightly confined spike blocks? And this is the water room, meaning you constantly float upwards and you need to press down to lower. How am I intended to dodge this? So naturally, I begin to try to precisely weave through this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle NES style bullshit. Maybe it won't be too bad? This room is ungodly. I can't believe actual programmers made this. This entire game, this entire level up to this point. Sure, the level design wasn't good, but at least it was fair. I will never forgive whoever made this abomination. Oh, wait a minute. You don't die if you hit the bottom of the spikes as long as you don't press up? Why? I do appreciate that the room is actually playable, but the block shows spikes on both sides, so the player is going to assume that both are bad. That might be the single worst game design I've ever seen in a video game. They could have at least changed how the blocks look in the modern mode. We're 55 minutes in, let's just move on. One aspect of the game that's worth mentioning is the shop system. At the start of certain levels, you will see a building that you can enter which has free items you can buy in order to make the game slightly easier to play. You get the money by breaking the gold blocks in the levels. This adds some risk since you're much more likely to get killed several times trying to grab money. And if you game over at any point, you'll lose all of the money you've acquired. So you have to be very careful, otherwise you'll end up being very frustrated trying to accrue money. The items you can get from the shop range in usefulness, with the power bracelet allowing you to shoot fireballs in order to increase your punch range. And on the other half of the spectrum, there is a car, which allows you to speed through enemies and the level. This all is going to be easy. Alright, I'm done. Yeah, if you hit anything, the car will instantly explode and you realize that the car is actually a scam. Every time I bought the car, I immediately crashed. Maybe it would be easy to use if the game had, I don't know, a single slope? If you want to avoid the shop and make the game shorter, there is another way to get the power bracelet specifically, being the question mark blocks that are scattered around the levels. These are interesting since they are a test of luck, since there are 3 possible things you can get out of these. The bracelet, an extra life, and the ghost enemy, which will chase you down and instantly kill you unless you scroll the screen past them. Finding these is pretty much an instant death sentence, but the blocks are actually not random since they're in a set order. But the first block is different based on the level, so once you figure out what the first spawn is, then you can perfectly predict what's in the blocks and utilize them to your advantage. I like the risk and reward of these, and it is much more interesting than a Mario block that just gives you a mushroom every time. That being said, there is something to be said about just how many things in this game exist just to randomly kill the player. The last part of this game I discussed is the rock, paper, scissors mechanic. At the end of some levels, you have to fight off a hand enemy in an extreme, fight to the death, no bar is held, life-changing rock, paper, scissors game. I find this part of all to be really annoying personally. Like, sure, it adds charm to the gameplay experience that you have to do something this goofy at the end of the level, but at the same time that means you can get through a whole level and whether or not you pass can come down to pure luck. There was more than one occasion where I had 1 life left getting to this point and I had to restart the whole level because I guessed wrong. And that in itself feels unfair to the player. Like, why? Is the game not hard enough? You literally just had to add a 1 in 3 chance at the very end. Thankfully, to the game's credit, the actual moves the enemy makes aren't randoms, so once you lose once, you can remember what they played and beat them instantly. There is an item to see what moves they'll make in order to avoid this, but I still hate that there is the mechanic that is inherently luck-based that is required for progression in a game that already feels so artificially difficult. In conclusion, I'm sort of torn on this game. The remake clearly has a lot of passion put into it. Everything is animated beautifully, and with the settings turned on, it controls much better. And they put in a lot of effort to update this game as much as they could. I don't blame the developers at all for how this remake turned out. To be honest, this game was pretty much doomed from the start. The problem is, by making a game that is a literal tile per tile remake, you keep every single issue that the original game has. All it really does is show just how outdated the original game was, and really just makes me wish that they either remade it from the ground up or made another sequel instead. Alex Kidd just really isn't a unique enough franchise to get a game like this. If you're in the market for a retro pixel art styled platformer on the Switch, then there are numerous examples of games that do that way better than this game does. Alex Kidd just isn't a household name for a lot of people, so at the end of the day, this game just feels like another generic platformer on the Switch.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class D license. I can't believe it. Was that your best? I don't think so.
Alrighty, House of the Dead Remake. The newest game to be released in this video and hopefully the last. It was developed by Forever Entertainment, the same team as the Panzer Dragoon remake, which probably explains the whole sequel remake delays, and should make me a bit skeptical since the reception to that one wasn't particularly great by fans. This does beg the question as to why they're remaking House of the Dead 1 specifically. I do understand that the original game was from 1996 and hasn't seen a home port since the Sega Saturn. I could understand why Sega would want to remake this particular game, seeing as it would be for a modern audience, who most likely has never played a House of the Dead game. The issue I have with this decision is that there was a new House of the Dead game released in 2018 called Scarlet Dawn, which would have been a more logical game to port instead. My guess is that it's more marketable to remake the old title since there's a lot more nostalgic value toward it, which I can't really argue with. That being said, I did get an opportunity to play the original House of the Dead arcade cabinet during the production of this video, so I guess this works out perfectly in hindsight. So how does this remake stack up then? Well, the main menu starts by giving you the worst possible first impression, with a loud music cue that kicks in over a laggy gameplay video with a stock blood overlay. Not sure why they thought this would improve the presentation, but I suppose it did shock me with just how sudden the music kicks in, so I'll count that as a scare. This has some pretty strong licensed game energy, which I sort of find charming, but to be completely honest, I do find this menu to be pretty annoying more than anything. Speaking of annoying, this game has some pretty bad load times. I know this is a Switch game, but I think 30 to 40 second loads for a rail shooter is questionable at best. It isn't Taxi Chaos bad or anything, and there is some saving grace in the hint text. I particularly like this zombie text emoji, it adds a lot of charm to the experience. Alright, before we start the actual game, this genre requires 2 players. Like, sure, you could sit down and play this solo, but in order to get the most enjoyment possible out of a game like this, you need a second player. So I had my boyfriend tag along to play this with me, and we ran into our second issue with the game. Player 2 cannot join if you've already started a level. You have to toggle multiplayer mode on the main menu first. Ignoring the fact that the option itself is very out of the way, seriously, I had actual trouble finding it. But this is a literal arcade game. They thrive on allowing players to join in anytime they want, since they can make the multiplayer experience as convenient as possible. You know, in order to encourage more spending, having to awkwardly pause and quit just to wait for the long loads just to enable the multiplayer mode comes across as extremely badly designed. Anyway, the opening cutscene shows us the presentation, and it's something. The goal of the game is to control 1 to 2 emotionless protagonists as they investigate the mansion. Along the way, they meet many characters, like this dying guy, for example. The cutscenes in this game are best described as inhuman. Everything feels off about the way that everyone speaks and looks. I'm convinced that everybody has already been zombified before we've even entered the mansion. The janky movement, the lack of facial animations, the character models, you can see their brain rot occurring in real time. I think it's best if we just start putting them out of their misery.
What happened?
Alright, I can't ignore it any longer. This game's budget is blatantly apparent. They are remaking a 3D game for the 90s, so the source material isn't going to be the easiest to update when compared to something that has stronger artistic direction like Space Channel 5. But I cannot look past the presentation. Every animation is the stiffest I've ever seen. The dialogue is ridiculous and delivered in the most unconvincing manner possible.
It's you!
There's absolutely no way I could take this experience seriously at all, and I really enjoy playing this game. It's great. They definitely stay true to the source material in this way, and honestly, I actually appreciate how cheesy this game is. Sure, they could have made the game super serious and dark, but would anyone take it seriously? I doubt it. Having every character move stiff as hell towards you to exchange laughable dialogue only adds charm to the experience. The voice acting is equally as memorable as the original games too. In fact, I would argue they made it even more cheesy. They took House of the Dead's over-the-top nature and cranked it to 10. I spent most of my playthrough just laughing along at how serious the tone of the plot is when combined with the cartoon-esque gameplay. I could sit here and tell you this game is trash or something, but honestly I had a lot of fun with this game. I do believe that the cheesy presentation and voice acting are things that are mostly done on purpose in spirit of the originals. So if that is the case, then I think the dev team did an amazing job utilizing the resources they had to lean into the low budget as a strength. Alright, I've taken the presentation part of my generic YouTube structure cheat sheet, so let's move on to the gameplay, which is where this being the Switch version ends up being beneficial. Since this game has gyro aiming support in order to emulate using a Wii pointer to aim or something similar, the entire structure of the game is to have quick reflexes and reaction time in order to eliminate the zombie hordes without taking damage. This also ties into an optional objective to save the civilians trapped in the mansion, which is told to the player in the very intro of the game. Trying to do do this with horrible joystick controls is way more cumbersome than it's worth, so just use the gyro aiming or the PlayStation Move, I guess. The zombies themselves are plentiful in number. You can't go more than a few seconds without them walking around corners or ambushing you, which helps keep the game exciting. And the game takes immediate advantage of this by testing your trigger discipline, since they love to throw civilians on screen, either directly in the middle of a zombie horde or with a camera pan to a new room, just so you can accidentally feel like a horrible person. Seriously, I felt so bad every time I did this. This high octane gameplay also puts the absolutely amazing ragdoll physics on prominent display. The image of Jim Carrey from The Mask being absolutely blasted into ragdoll form is something that I think will stick with me my entire life. These put the final nail in the undead coffin for this game being taken seriously. This proves that the developers had to be self-aware about the goofiness in this game. You could add cartoon sound effects to this and it would be hilarious. But this does begin to show some of the inconsistencies with this approach, since despite the amount of comedic elements present in the game, it is still an M-rated horror game. There is still blood, and zombies will be dismembered in pretty gnarly ways. It sends a bit of a mixed tone. I guess I could just change the color of the blood in order to match the lighthearted tone. Oh wait, that's only in the PC version. Thank you, developers. Although Doom Eternal allows you to collect cute toy versions of the demons, so I think I'm just looking too deep into this. In reality, the only part of the game that bothered me enough to mention is the final boss of the game, Magician. Sorry, I had to see that again. The boss flies around quickly and frequently spawns projectiles you have to shoot. Now that's annoying enough on its own, but it's not the issue I have with the boss. The problem I have is that the boss has an inhumanely long health bar. Like a health bar is so long that even while playing this 2-player, my hands started to cramp up multiple times. It is literally painful to beat this boss. Another thing I should probably bring up is the game's length, being around 40 minutes for a story mode, which might immediately sound bad. Wow, Sega can only afford to remake one 40-minute arcade game, they must suck. But this isn't as much of an issue as it would be in a game like Panzer Dragoon, since this game thrives off of being a fun multiplayer game, so you would be much more likely to replay it. The game also incentivizes you to return with optional branching paths alongside the previously mentioned civilian rescue mechanic. Although once again, they did release Scarlet Dawn in 2018, which has a runtime that's roughly an hour, which makes the choice to remake this one a bit more odd. Honestly, I like the House of Dead remake. Despite some flaws, I still think it's a fun game that you can pick up and have an enjoyable time with. Although I would not recommend the Switch version if you have the choice. As nice as the gyro support is, this game suffers from pretty much every Switch performance issue you could think of. The frame rate is a bit spotty, and although it is perfectly playable, it is very distracting. Not to mention that the game also has a horde mode that makes the zombie count even higher, so the performance just takes a massive dip. And just a reminder that all of the footage in this video is with the performance mode, so I really don't know how any of this would run in the normal mode. Personally, I would either recommend the PS4 version if you have the PlayStation Move, or the PC version since it has the most amount of customization and likely runs the best. Either way, as a whole, this remake is a mixed bag depending on what you're really looking for in a House of the Dead game. Do you want the campy, over-the-top cheese of ancient rail shooters and can excuse a lot of the shortcomings in the presentation? Or do you want a more fleshed out horror take on the franchise? Personally, it's a House of the Dead game. You're going in for the over-the-top experience, and I think this game delivers that in spades. I really enjoyed this entry and can recommend it if rail shooters of old or something that's on your radar.
Alright, it's time to check out how you did today. Now let's take a look. Class B license. Decided to play it safe, huh? Come back next time and show us your best. Game over.
Alright, we're finally done talking about Sega games. For reference, I didn't write this part of the video until I was finished editing every ever section of the video, so needless to say, I am very tired, but we're not done yet. We still have things to discuss. Alright, the rankings are in, and here they are. Not looking great. As you can see, there's a lot of variety in the quality of the entries, but it does lean more towards being mediocre or bad. Now, I have a lot to say about my experience naturally, but before we do that, we have to get into our first intermission. Nah, just kidding, I'm just gonna talk about the positives first. Let's start with why I started making this video in the first place. I love Sega franchises. I grew up as a Nintendo kid, GameCube era specifically, which I know is a huge surprise. Growing up as a Gen Z Sonic Heroes playing Scum of the Earth, I had heard about many of these other Sega franchises that I wanted to play, but I couldn't due to availability or just a lack of time. So I used the opportunity to jump back in and see if Sega's been getting back to form. Thanks to this video, I was able to revisit Streets of Rage, Crazy Taxi, and Space Shuttle 5 in order to appreciate them way more than I could before. Panzer Dragoon went from a series I couldn't care less about to me trying to look into other entries of the franchise like Orta. Even then, aside from the E-ranks, I had fun with every game I played to some extent. Honestly, my only regret when working on this video is that there was a ChuChu Rocket revival that I didn't cover. It being an Apple Arcade game, I questioned why not it even counted for this video, but at the end of the day, I guess it's just a missed opportunity. Wait, what is that? What is going on? What is going on? Ah!
Hey
Hey guys, Jeff Compass here. I'm here to tell you about ChuChu Rocket Universe today. It was deleted off of Apple Arcade the second I tried to record footage. I reached out to the community manager, Danny, who forwarded me this press release. As far as I know, this is the only public statement regarding this game's removal, and he did give me permission to post it on this occasion. Yeah, this is kind of awkward. But I will analyze some pre-existing footage on the internet right now. So we gotta be a thief and steal some footage from YouTubers here. I'll be analyzing iOS Touch Plays HD early game footage today. To give a little background here, ChuChu Rocket Universe was released in 2019 to support the Apple Arcade service that a total of 5 people cared about, maybe 4. The game starts up and we see a bunch of mice on the moon. Now tell me, why are there mice on the moon? Unless, you know, it's made of cheese. I mean, if that's some cheese, that's some moldy cheese. I mean, it's blue. Dr. Eggman wannabe emerges and sucks up all the mice. 4 mice in bright colors come out of hiding and take a rocket ship up, and we have our game. Now look, this cutscene obviously looks cheap, but I think for a mobile game that's fine. The game doesn't even have a price. It was just part of the Apple Arcade subscription service. Keyword being was. It's gone. Concept's simple enough. You touch a tile, add a direction, and try to direct the mice into the goal. It works pretty well on mobile for obvious reasons, which even looking back at the Dreamcast version, it's like, you know, this is cool, but this could have also been a cheap PC game. Changed my mind. But you see, this game is ChuChu Rocket Galaxy, a universe. Yep, clearly not inspired by any game with the name of Galaxy. That's preposterous. So the layouts we have here are circular and can be rotated by your finger. You start with one mouse and later on get more to feed to the goal. It's a basic puzzle game, something like a hybrid of Snake and Minesweeper, or like those annoying ice puzzles from Pokemon. As time goes on, it introduces new hazards like spikes, enemies, and walls. It's kind of similar to the previously released GBA version, but I don't know, I think the bad pixelated graphics works a bit better. It's kind of jarring to see everything in 3D, kind of just doesn't feel right. I like the idea of playing this on old hardware, it just feels like it fits more in the early 2000s. But yeah, Universe, I mean, it's fine, nothing mind-blowing, but nothing horrible either. That applies to most mobile games. In the context of a Sega revival, it really isn't that good of one at all. I mean, I guess you can make the argument they targeted a casual audience here, and I think that's fine, since I don't think they're ever going to really make a straight-up console remake of this game. I don't think you could, especially because handhelds aren't really a thing anymore. But I give this game a nothing ranking because it doesn't exist. I hope you enjoyed this segment that Now Ninja could have easily done, because he could have just done this with footage off of the internet.
That happened, I guess. Anyway, if you're interested in forgotten Sega franchises, Jeff made a video on the Jet Set Radio franchise that I helped edit, if you want to check that out. With that ad read over, let's get back to the topic at hand. As much as I liked each of these games individually, this is a video about revivals. And looking back at the tier list, how many of these games can I say are a truly good revival of their respective franchise? Maybe like 4 or 5. But why? You'd think that Sega would put in their all to make sure these games are as good as they could be in order to bring back their franchises to their glory days. Well, unfortunately, as a whole, I don't think Sega really revived these franchises as good as we would have wanted to see. There is still some potential for them in the future, mind you, but most of these 10 or 11 games failed to recapture the magic that Sega used to possess. How? Well, let me be critical for a second. Woo! Well, if only half of the selection feels like a proper revival, then what about the other half? A lot of these fall under having lost potential, like Alex Kidd being a way too faithful remake, and Space Channel 5 being a VR title which limits its potential audience, or having no chance to be good like Shenmue 3. The game with shortcomings that I feel the need to point out specifically is Panzer Dragoon Remake. Well, if Streets of Rage 4 feels like a loving parent to its respective IP, then Panzer Dragoon feels like its dad went to buy milk and never returned. Listen, I'm sure Megapixel Studios and Forever Entertainment care deeply about the series. The game's credits shout out all the fan sites and moderators, so I know that they do, but I feel like with the Panzer Dragoon remake, and to a lesser extent with the House of the Dead remake, that Sega just wanted to get out a game with as low of a budget as possible, just to see if the fans would still support it. So they just took the super short first Panzer Dragoon game, handed it off to this dev team, and just called it a day. That conclusion sounds harsh, but when looking up how the fans felt about this remake, most of what I saw was vile hatred for this entry, and a laundry list full of just how much this game didn't stay true to the original. This remake really doesn't do the series justice at all from what I saw. If they wanted to bring the series back properly, they could have just ported Panzer Dragoon Orta from the original Xbox, or even Panzer Dragoon Saga, which some people claim to be one of the best RPGs of all time. It would have been great to have a version of the game that doesn't require taking out a loan to play. Remaking the first game literally shines the worst possible light of what the series is capable of to anyone who might have been interested in getting into the series, like me for example. These kinds of issues extend to almost every game I covered here. Firstly, the length of the games. Space Channel 5, House of the Dead, and Panzer Dragoon are all less than an hour as a complete package. I can't help but feel that a lot of these remakes really struggle to justify their price tags, which is a really concerning issue to have when most of these games are less than $30. Maybe Sega really wanted to just rush out as many IPs as possible to see which ones people would buy, and didn't pay much attention to how the fan bases would react to these releases. Like how they brought back Super Monkey Ball, which used to be a critically acclaimed, high-selling franchise during the GameCube era, arguably around the popularity of Sonic at the time. The fans were clamoring for a game that would bring the series back to the heights it had reached back in the day, since its track record had been rocky after the GameCube. Instead, Sega decided to remake the worst game in the franchise, purely because it was the Wii launch title that was riding off of its previously earned reputation, despite the fact that the fans absolutely despise this game and attribute it with being the reason why the series died in the first place. I really want to appreciate that Sega is trying to make new games for many of these series that frankly deserved way better than what Sega has given them. The game I can point to with the most amount of praise is Streets of Rage 4, but that was created because the developers approached Sega themselves in order to create their passion product. All of the games that Sega released themselves have felt underdeveloped, poorly conceived, or rushed, or possibly a mixture of all three. The part that makes this all worse is that this is Sega we're talking about. They are the kings at making memorable games that ooze effort and stick with their players. These remakes just feel like soulless cash grabs, and that makes me really sad. I expect so much better from this company. I really wish I knew why this was the case. Maybe their luck has finally run out and they need the money more than ever, so they just have to throw out anything and hope that it sticks. Maybe they save all of their budgets and time for Sonic, Yakuza, and Atlas, so they can't afford to risk putting money into quirky new ideas and would rather focus on what works. I suppose those could be the reason and would make sense. At the end of the day, I just want to see them be the best they can be, so I hope they learn from these and improve. With this being said, Sega isn't completely down and out yet. I think they can bounce back and start putting out bangers again. Super Monkey Ball isn't quite at the level of quality that I would like at this moment, but they've been making steady progress getting it back on track, so the next entry could be exactly what the fans want, hopefully. Despite Sonic Forces being a complete embarrassment and Frontiers having a gameplay reveal on par with a D-tier Nintendo Direct announcement, subsequent news has made it look like it's going to be a banger game. Even if all else fails, they still have Atlas and Yakuza, which will pretty much always succeed. I was extremely negative towards the end of this journey, but it's just because Sega as a company has so much untapped potential that I want them to utilize. I know they can reach it, even if the journey to transition into greatness is as long and rocky as Sonic YouTubers describe it as. At the end of the day, I really want Sega to continue to make these remakes. Sega has so many IPs that they still haven't brought back, like Jet Set Radio, that could very easily be a very well-selling game. If they keep trying to make these and actually put in the time and effort that they deserve, then I think it will work out in the end. I just fear that Sega's priorities won't be where they need to be, but I really want you to prove me wrong and make great games again, but it's all up to you. Hey, I had originally filmed an outro to this video months ago when the writing wasn't fully finalized, so unfortunately it doesn't really mesh, but I'll still show you it. I just want to provide a ranking for Sega's revivals as a whole, which is a resounding, I know you didn't study on the test, please try harder. If you've gone this far, thank you for watching, I really do appreciate it. I spent so long making this video, it's kind of been a bit surreal to be honest, but with that, I'm gonna leave. I'll show you the old outro. I'm gonna get out of here. Bye. How do I end videos? Sorry. At the end of the day, these remakes are a really good idea for Sega. Bringing back their old franchises in a way that makes fun. Hi.
What are you doing in my house?
No reason.
I don't have a spare key. Like, how did you get in here?
Well, if you see that window, it's like that kind of.
You broke my window again? This is the second time. I'm calling the cops. Get out. Get out. Get out. Yeah, I'd like to report a belligerent monkey ball reviewer. This is a Wendy's? What?
Well, let me be critical for a second. Woo, baby, that's what. Should we get enough?